Hi, Ray Pointer here, and I'm joined today by Gaelle Bertrand, and we're going to tackle the third of the three webinars about social media intelligence. And so welcome, Gaelle.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me a platform to talk about social media insights.
And today we're going to talk about the balance between quant and qual and combining the two. So if somebody comes to you and they're asking advice about a new social media project and they say, should we do qual or should we do quant? How would you answer that question?
I think I would probably start with saying it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And it's true of the methodology that you want to apply, so qual or quant. And it also applies to the sources you're selecting. If you haven't watched the previous webinar, which was about sources, I would encourage you to do that. But in social media insight or social media research, the premise and the process is the same as in any research process. You will adapt the methodology to what you're trying to achieve. Now, one of the issues with social media as a source of insight is that often it's seen as a quantitative source of information because it's a vast source of information. So people think that it's better treated in a quantitative way. I don't disagree with that. It has some of the characteristics of any big data source in that it's obviously potentially millions of conversations happening which you need to go through. But there's also a perception as well that with social media, bigger is better. So the larger data sets mean more insight, when more often than not, that's not actually true. You can derive a lot of insight from a small body of conversation, and you can often glean more powerful insights from a single forum threads than a large amount of Twitter posts. And that's because you may, as part of your objectives, want to find out sort of a more qualitative or a more subjective type of insight, such as look at experiences, look at motivations, or look at journeys, which inherently are very individual and will be a collection of specific motivations, experience, etc. So at that point, a qualitative approach might be more suited than a pure quantitative approach, which is about counting or denumerating specific topics.
So what sort of things are quantitative approaches useful for?
I think on the most basic level, quantitative techniques are very useful to understand what I call the anatomy of the conversation. So understanding where the conversation is happening and to what level that conversation is happening. And having that quantitative base is really useful because it's like understanding your universe. If I take traditional research as a basis for understanding, is if you know your universe, then you'll be able to make the right choices. So having a view of where the conversations are happening and what the volumes are in each instance is going to be very important. And that's a quantitative exercise for sure. Knowing, potentially understanding how the topic is discussed and using some of the technology that's out there and sort of having a broad idea as to what topics are coming up as well is something that can be a quantitative exercise, specifically because if it's aided by entity extraction or text analysis and recognition, can be a really powerful way of quickly understanding what is being discussed and whether you're on the right track, actually. So as you know, probably a lot of social media listening is dictated by what words you search for. And sometimes you search for specific words which you think will appear in conversation, but actually when you look at the results, you see that actually that's not at all how people discuss it. So having that quantitative view of what comes up most often within conversation can be really, really useful at the outset to try and understand whether you're on the right track and whether you're capturing the right conversations for your objectives as well. One of the useful quantitative sources of data actually is demographics. So Twitter is one of the sources that provides you demographics as part of their traditional output. And I think that's a really useful source of information when you want to try and understand, again, whether you're in the right ballpark with the audience that you're listening to. So it can sometimes be quite useful. And again, it's a quantitative exercise, albeit sometimes not all tweets have a demographic attached to them, which means that the robustness of that data can vary, but it's often a useful source of insight. And also, what I haven't mentioned yet, but is really a quantitative exercise and a useful exercise is, and where social media listening really comes into its own, is where you're trying to measure something. So if you're trying to measure the impact of specific campaigns, for example, a quantitative exercise is really what you need to be doing using social media data. Of course, the metrics that you will use will very much depend on your campaign objectives, and you need to be very mindful that your measurement framework matches the objectives of your campaign so that you're measuring something which is meaningful. But metrics is definitely something that will be, a quantitative exercise. The other aspect, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about identifying the frequency of topics within a specific data set, is that automated techniques and quantitative techniques can help you get to understand broad trends as well. So it's not just about topics within a specific theme, but it's also going to be about potential trends. And thanks to technology which has been developed and uses, of course, entity extraction, which I mentioned earlier, but also uses machine learning, it's something that, I'm starting to see emerge more and more as a quantitative exercise or possibility.
So what might the limits be? So if we think about something like women's football, which has become more popular in terms of viewing and participation, presumably we could, by watching in social media, see that the number of women posting about this has increased. We could look and see which topics they started to talk about, but we wouldn't be able to project to say how many women in society were doing that. So we could do A, but we couldn't do B within that. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think you would only, and that's something that has often either stopped or spurred on people, I would say, with the practice of social media listening, is that the reason why it's taken quite a long time for social media to be accepted as a source of insight and as a firm part of a researcher's toolkit is the fact that often you cannot do sizing with it. And sizing is really difficult to do because you might have to basically discard some of the data, which means that grossing it up in the same way that you would do with a quantitative survey is not going to be possible because you don't know what the universe is. Despite the fact that I said that it's, the quantitative techniques allow you to understand the universe, sometimes that universe is so infinite that you're missing a lot of it, which means that you can't really project to the universe, if you get my meaning. So I think that's one of the limitations. But then on the reverse, I think that often people think that what they see with social media is the universe, which is also a danger potentially with using it, because they're going to try and extrapolate it, which is often, quite hard to do and quite imprecise. So, but it's definitely one of the limitations.
So that's having a good look at quantitative. So now let's think about qualitative. When is qualitative useful and how would you go about using it?
The qualitative use of it is a little bit more intuitive, I would say, because it's very much in line with what you would expect qualitative techniques to be used for. So fundamentally, it's a great source of ethnographic research to look at language in particular, to look at experiences, emotions, journeys, needs, attitudes, albeit a person is not expressing them to you and you're watching in the background, much like, classic ethnography would take place, is that you're reading them and you're trying to understand them through what they're writing. So that's basically the fundamentals of it, is that it will be quite rich in learning about the various people that are talking. Now, it's not just about understanding the language, the experience, and the emotions. It's also about understanding people. So you can do that as well with social media. It's understanding people and who they are, and not just what they do. So by using qualitative techniques such as interpretative technique, for example, using potential associations, you can really get to personas and the types of people that would be having these conversations. One of the difficulties, I guess, is that often people are potentially concerned about interpreting what they're seeing because they're concerned about extrapolating too much and adding too much meaning. But the safeguard around that is actually providing yourself with enough of the context around the conversations that you really understand what is going on fully. By understanding the context around it, so it could be the cultural context in which the conversations are happening, by understanding the way that the online platform or online site, which is being used to post those thoughts and feelings, is being used, which will obviously give you that additional context. Because I feel that if you don't have that additional context, you don't potentially know what is missing from it. So if you do know how the platform is used, and if you do know the cultural context, it will give you a little bit more confidence to be able to interpret what you're seeing. What's also quite useful, and is probably what people do the most these days from a qualitative standpoint, is rather than trying to understand individuals through a qualitative process by reading online discourse or online content, is understanding a community. So rather than trying to zoom in on the individual, they will try and zoom in on a specific community of interest, which in a way is much easier to observe than a single individual, because you don't need to have as much of that context. And also by identifying members of that specific community and reading the interactions between them, you'll get a bit more of that context than you would if you're just looking at a single post, for example. So I think that's where the qualitative approach really comes into its own, is when you're trying to understand that community. And it very much works in parallel with, what online communities are trying to do as a research process. Social media listening in this context is essentially trying to do the same type of work, except that the conversation is not prompted.
And one of the things I'm beginning to see quite a few people talking about is combining qual and quant, and we hear this phrase, qual at scale. So where might combining qual and quant take us, do you think?
So the idea of qualitative at scale is really where, the process of social media insight comes from, is essentially using this qualitative interpretation, but doing it at scale on enough data points so that you can derive a quantitative output from it as well. So what I mean by that is potentially selecting, a random sample of post, and it can be, it could be, I'm not talking about tweets. In fact, it's often not tweets, but say looking at a random sample of forum posts, for example, analyzing those forum posts, analyzing enough of them so that they're robust. So I'm talking about analyzing, 2, 3, 4, 500 potentially, often manually, because that's where you derive the most insight, and analyzing them against a framework which is akin to what you would do if you were analyzing qualitative outputs. So for example, if you're analyzing groups, or if you're analyzing depth interviews conducted over the phone, where you kind of start using a framework to try and shine different lens onto some of what you've uncovered. So the idea of qualitative at scale is exactly that: is you're creating a framework which you're using consistently to be able to code essentially conversations manually, and enough conversations that when you come to deriving your output, you can also look at the incidence of specific aspects of your framework within the data set, and your data set is robust enough at that point to be able to derive confidence in the quantitative data that you output. So that's some of the techniques that I've been using over the past few years, and have been, I would say, some of the most effective. One of the things I would say is that with the advent of technology and especially entity extraction, becoming more and more precise, often you can have a quantitative process which precedes that qualitative at scale process, in which you're using tools to be able to help you categorize data in a way which will allow you to draw your qualitative at scale samples in a more systematic way. So for example, if you're looking at a specific topic of interest, you might want to do some simple structuring of the data to start with around some of the areas which are easy to categorize often to start with, because you know that will save you work and you won't have to apply it as part of your qualitative at scale framework. So that's where technology helps, and that strength of combining qualitative and quantitative techniques come into their own, but still allow you to do that deep diving. So you never forget, you never, get rid of your humans. You are analyzing the data. You're just helping yourself by using the machine do what it does best, which is do a repetitive process, which a human would take much longer to do.
You've mentioned there AI, artificial intelligence. Where might that take us next in terms of this blending of qual and quant, do you think?
I mean, it's a vast subject, probably a subject I don't know enough about. So it will be what I think is, a semi-educated opinion I'm going to give you. But I certainly have seen what has been developed so far, and some of the tools that exist out there to be able to group and categorize data. And compared to 5 years ago, when I did a talk with you, Ray, around humans and machines, I'm more and more confident that some of the heavy lifting is going to be possible through AI. So basically, through the automation of processes which manually would take more time. What I think, so I'm quite confident that some of the processes that we're doing manually now will probably won't be doing manually in 5-10 years' time. I guess the slight barrier to the adoption of this technology potentially will be cost, of course, because they won't be put into play if they're not commercially viable, I think, or supported in such a way that they will continue existing. And also, I think that the slight concern for me has always been around AI, that people think it will replace some of the human processes. And while I think it will help us, and I think it will not replace us. I think it would only help sort of get it to a point where you're giving humans a lot more space for this interpretation and a lot more space for this creative process of understanding what it means and how it can be applied to the organization. So, but I do feel, I mean, I have seen tools in the past year or so which have impressed me in that they're able to detect topics, for example, in social media content, not just in social media content, but potentially there's applications beyond that, such as, call center transcripts and reviews and all sorts of data, where the way that the entities are being derived fills me with quite a lot of confidence, which is something I wouldn't have said probably 5 years ago.
Super. I would probably add a little bit about broadening the areas we can easily look at. So we're seeing implementations that listen to audio. So we can turn audio into text. We're looking at AI that works well with images. And of course, put those two together, and you then have the ability to take video and make that more available to the researcher in similar ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it will help us, and it will help the sort of the transcript aspect, and also the advances that have been made in the last 5 years, even in sort of image recognition, logo recognition, understanding the context, for example. These are all very useful, but I think one of the traps always is that people are going to think that the machine is going to spit out why this background is important, or why having this beer in the foreground is really important, when actually you're still going to need a human interpretation to make sense as to why that picture was composed in that way, or that video is composed in that way. So yeah, I think that's what is now being done to text is also developing rapidly with images, rapidly with video, which is important because a lot of the media which is now being output on social is actually visual. So you do need that. Although I would argue that, and we're going back to sources a minute, so go back to the webinar, but that I did a month ago. But I would argue that the usefulness of the medium is really going to be dictated with what you want to learn, and then at that point you'll need to decide whether you need to use that data.
Great, that's been fantastic, Gaelle. Thank you so much for this third of 3. And now let's go to questions.